Hey guys, welcome back for our second chapter here on linkage institutions. Today we're going to be looking at campaigns and elections. Throughout this chapter, we're going to largely focus on the presidential election and how that works start to finish. Talk a little bit about how it's influenced by the campaigns, how campaigns shape outcomes of elections, talk about how voters can learn about candidates for office, and then we'll talk about some key differences between presidential and congressional elections. The last bit of chapter 10 is going to be about campaign finance in the modern era and in sort of broad overview of campaign finance regulation and how that influences campaigns and elections, and ultimately how all of that shapes public policy. All right, so we got a few questions to start here. The first is, how do American elections determine the types of people or the kinds of people that govern us? And one of the things that we see is sort of unique about the American system of elections is that there's a huge focus on personal appeal, especially in the age of modern media. And so American democracy really rewards candidates who have personal appeal more so than just straight party endorsement. This tends to produce candidates that have strong ideological orientation towards either liberal or conservative causes. We generally find that most of our candidates for public office tend to be more conservative or more liberal than the average American. And a lot of that has to do with how the primary process works. During that primary process, when Republicans are running against other Republicans or Democrats run against other Democrats, we can lots of times see that there is, if someone's truly a moderate, there might be some accusations of whether or not they truly fit the bill. Like, are they actually a Republican? Are they a rhino, a Republican in name only? Do they truly stand for the political values of the party? And that process tends to weed out moderates and keeps us with candidates who have that stronger ideological orientation. The second question is, what matters most to us when it comes to who wins the presidency or who wins Congress? And I said more and more people today identify as independent, but it turns out that regardless of their party identification, it's estimated that only about 10 to 20% of voters are actually willing to have their mind changed. So some of the most important factors on the outcome of a presidential election, the number one factor is the economy. Voters vote, and certainly independent voters vote, based on whether or not they feel like they are doing economically well. We also see a huge emphasis on, in a wartime economy, are there wartime successes? Are there wartime failures? We can see in, the World War II era, FDR is able to successfully run for 4 terms in office during the Great Depression and World War II. So those things certainly have an impact. Presidential character, the character of the candidate, is going to play a role as well. Do they resonate with people? And if so, they might secure those votes in the primary. But overall, the candidate's personality and character probably plays more of a role in congressional campaigns than it does in presidential campaigns. Presidential campaigns for the incumbent party, that is the party that is currently in office, can be really challenging if the economy is in a poor position. The final question is, do elections make real differences in what laws are enacted? So do they have a real impact on public policy? And the short answer is yes. During the campaign, parties might actually try and sound a little bit more moderate to attract those centrist voters. Not always, but that is one of the strategies of parties when they're running campaigns. And then when they get into office, we actually see that their policies differ more than what's maybe projected during the campaign. And so those policies that are enacted, especially when you have unified government, which lots of times happens at the beginning of a new president's term in office, those policies are put into effect and have, they're able to make some sweeping changes to government. They might not outlast the midterms or even the full term in office for the president, but certainly early on in a term, presidential candidates who win are going to try and push a lot of public policy that tends to be pretty ideological in nature through. Now, the word campaign is pretty broad, and campaigns encompass a lot of different actions, some of which take place by paid organizers, some of which take place by volunteers, but there's several tasks that happen within a campaign, and so we've kind of broken those down on your sheet. The major spend area for campaigns is going to be on media and media consultants. So campaigns spend millions, billions of dollars creating ads and buying airtime from TV and radio stations. They also do some direct-to-consumer marketing through direct mail firms. And if maybe you noticed in the last election cycle that I get mailers like this almost daily at my house where they're promoting a certain candidate, they might be soliciting money for the campaign, or just trying to encourage you to get out to vote. The other thing campaigns spend quite a bit of money on, particularly in swing states, maybe not so much in North Dakota, is polling firms. They want to initiate some of their own polling to survey voters on their attitudes towards the candidate, the issues, and this is going to help them write their speeches and prepare kind of their next moves in the campaign and figure out where they need to spend their time and their resources moving forward. Political technology firms oftentimes do some of that polling as well, but they might also offer more comprehensive services like designing websites or online advertisements, running online fundraising, or gathering voter data so that campaigns can do that micro-targeting that we have talked about in previous lessons. As I mentioned, today's candidates by and large spend most of their money on media. And in 2024, nearly $16 billion was spent on media. And that price tag is an estimate, but we know that it's up from 2020, where there was about a $14 billion spend on ad campaigns, and 2020 had doubled the spending from the 2016 presidential campaign. Now, you would think with all of that money being spent that media exposure would make a critical difference in election outcomes and that ads would change voter attitudes, but experts don't actually know whether or how media makes a difference in outcome. So, it's entirely possible that voters just get sick of the ads, right? But would you rather a voter get sick of your ad or not know your name at all because they haven't seen the ad, right? And we know that name recognition for uninformed voters is a major indicator of who they might vote for. They're likely to vote for someone who they've heard that name before, right? In addition, we also know that ads tend to largely focus on the negative and tap into voters' fears about what could happen if their opponent won, right? And that sort of thing. So a lot of negative advertising is done, which can also be pretty exhausting for voters. In modern campaigns, we tend to see some newer areas or newer techniques. The first of which is extensive polling, right? There's pre and post-election polling. Campaigns are constantly using data and results from this polling to design ads, to design a candidate's position on the issues, even determine things like what words a candidate should repeat, what sort of phrases seem to resonate with people, or test voters' attitudes about how to change their perspectives. So there's polling done on literally everything to see what resonates with voters so that the campaign can possibly tap into that. There's also high-tech canvassing, or we call it micro-targeting, which we've mentioned before. It's using data on consumer and recreational habits to make some projections about who might support a certain campaign. Because since so few voters are actually able to change their mind, a lot of the campaign strategy is about tapping into those people that you already know support you. And even recreational habits, those things outside of politics, can have an influence and have shown to have some consistent trends. For example, if you drive a small car, say you drive a Prius, you drive a hybrid, versus a big truck. Well, what's that possibly say about your politics, right? They're reading into everything. What kind of coffee do you drink? Do you drink coffee? Do you drink tea, right? That micro targeting, all that information on consumers that companies have, can also be sold to or tapped into by campaigns to help them figure out what motivates voters, how do I get them to the polls, those sorts of things. And finally, in modern campaigns, campaigning has become sort of synonymous with fundraising. Candidates, because campaigns are so expensive, and we've seen increased campaign spending across the board, there's a lot of time and resources devoted to raising the money that's needed to be able to compete. Even non-competitive races, say in North Dakota, you want to run for Congress or you want to run for the U.S. Senate, even races that we would presume are non-competitive, there's still millions of dollars spent on influencing voters and trying to get them out to vote. So a lot of the work of campaigns, modern campaigns today, is raising money. So we didn't really have a primary to work off of for the 2024 presidential election, given that President Biden stepped out so late in the game. And so we're going to use the 2020 nomination process to talk about how we whittle down sort of these pools of individuals to figure out who is going to be the candidate that is running for office for the two major parties. So in 2020, the Republicans really did not have much of a primary fight. They had an incumbent president, right? President Trump was already in office, and it's sort of the norm to just go with the sitting president if they're interested in running again for your party nomination. But on the Democratic side, there was a pretty busy primary fight, and getting through the primary, getting through that nominations process really requires individual effort. Each of these individuals in the blue bubbles had to make a decision to run, and they have to largely self-finance or finance through donations up until they get the party endorsement. So the Democrats had a lot of people on the scene. Now, ultimately, it gets whittled down to these two guys in the 2020 election, and so we're going to talk about how that process works. Now, one of the things worth mentioning, we've talked about political parties, is that political parties are like a big tent. They're a catch-all. And so if we're looking at the Democratic Party and all of the people that ran for the Democratic nomination, there are many subtypes within them. And Republicans, the same thing, right? So there's sort of the party establishment or the party loyalists, and people like Joe Biden were doing really well amongst that group. And then you can see here, like, Bernie Sanders appealed to the further left of the party. You have some different sort of core groups, right? Millennials, so at the time, kind of the younger voters. Black voters have always been a strong, basically since FDR, have been strongly Democratic. So we can see who are they performing well with, right? That sort of thing. And so we have a lot of sort of subtypes, and a lot of the primary process is whittling down to which of these people and ideologies do we want to go with. So step one, every state needs to hold a caucus or a primary. And these are the steps that have occurred since 1968. Prior to 1968, it's party leaders who select the people running for office. So every state holds a caucus or a primary. We'll talk about the difference between the two, but earlier states tend to get more attention. The Iowa caucus goes first, usually shortly followed by the New Hampshire primary. There's been some talk of like switching up the order so that campaign resources are more widely spread and hit different demographics, but for now, that's what it is. Now, the purpose of competing in caucuses and primaries is to win delegates. And delegates are going to be people who represent whoever won that contest at the state or local level. And they're going to go to the national convention and they're going to vote for that person. So the more delegates you win, the more likely you are to win the nomination of the party. It's important to note at this stage we're running Democrats against other Democrats and Republicans against other Republicans. And then, like I said, the delegates attend the National Convention where they officially choose their presidential candidate. So like I said, nominations are all about earning delegates. These are some delegates from the 2008 Democratic Convention when Barack Obama was nominated. 2012 Republican Convention when Mitt Romney was nominated. Sometimes they like to wear matching outfits, so on and so forth. So the goal is get enough delegates to the national convention that you win. Now, a primary looks kind of just like a normal election, and we'll come back to that. But we're going to talk about caucuses because they're a little more strange. So caucuses are like an old-fashioned political meeting where, say, I'm going to get my whole neighborhood around the dinner table and we're just going to talk and get together and think about how do we campaign for this next election? Who's going to run for office? Who's going to volunteer to knock doors, right? All of those things. Now, we've had to bring a little bit more organization to that process, and so I'll give you a glimpse of what that looks like. So this is the actual data from 2020, the Democratic primary the Democratic caucus in Iowa. And this is just one precinct, okay? So one little area of Des Moines, and Roosevelt High School is where this data is taken from. So about 500 people show up, and they're all kind of supporting different groups of people for the party's nomination. And so how a caucus works is first you say, okay, go join your preference group. Everybody, we're in a high school gym. If you support Elizabeth Warren, you go over there. If you support Bernie Sanders, you go over there. You name it, right? And you physically organize yourselves into preference groups, and then they do an initial count. And this was the outcome of the initial count. Now, in Democratic caucuses, the Republicans do it a little bit different, but in Democratic caucuses, you need to have 15% of the people present to be considered viable. Only viable candidates are going to earn delegates. So, at this point, after the first count, the non-viable groups have to either join another group or they can leave. Or if they're close to that viability, they can try and convince some people to move over to them so they become viable. And in this case, the Andrew Yang supporters are either going to have to leave or join another group, but the Biden supporters are close to that 15%. And so precinct captains are going to try and convince others, come this way, come join our group. I know Andrew Yang didn't do well, but like Biden might be your best second choice, right? You name it. So they try and sort of campaign within the group, and then they do a recount. Biden becomes viable in the recount here with 73 individuals in that preference group. And in this precinct, they award 9 delegates, that's based on population, to go to the county convention, and they award proportionally. So you can see Elizabeth Warren leaves this precinct with the most, with 3 delegates. Sanders and Buttigieg each take 2, Biden and Klobuchar each 1. So then amongst the group, they choose their delegates. Who wants to go to the county and state convention to rep Elizabeth Warren, right? And they would go there and they would vote. I had the opportunity to be a delegate at a state convention one time. Super cool opportunity if you're interested in doing something like that. Usually it starts by getting involved with your local political party. So then they go to Polk County Democratic Convention. Around the Des Moines area, there's over 170 precincts, and so a lot of people come and show up. They cast their votes for the groups they're representing, and then the county convention selects delegates to move forward to the state convention. The state convention selects delegates to move forward to the national convention. Now, up until the last couple of elections, the Democratic Party used superdelegates. And superdelegates were basically people within the party who were like notable politicians, essentially party elites. And so superdelegates were allowed to just vote for whoever they wanted. The Democrats brought the end to the superdelegate model after the 2016 election because there was a lot of sort of infighting in the party over Clinton getting like all of the superdelegate votes and Sanders getting like none of them, and it's enough to like offset what could have possibly been a Sanders victory, or at least he could have gotten closer. So the superdelegates are no longer in play. The Republican Party hasn't had them. The Democrats did for a long time, but it's just not the case anymore. But these would have been people who would have been free to support whatever candidate they wanted. And Democrats at the time of the 2016 election had over 700 superdelegates present. Now, primaries, as I mentioned, look just like regular elections, except you only vote for one party. There's a couple different types of primaries. You can have open primaries or closed primaries. In North Dakota, because we don't register with a political party, we have an open primary, so anyone can participate, and just on primary election day, you choose which side of the ballot you want to vote on. Can't vote on both, right? And so, to be honest, sometimes I like to vote in the one that has more of a contest in play. Even in an open primary, I can do that, right? I don't have to be a party member to participate. In a closed primary, I have to be a registered party member to participate. And so, like, independents, for example, cannot vote in closed primaries. But looks really similar to a regular election. Usually in North Dakota, they're sometime in June, early June, and you just go fill the bubbles. So primary elections, a little bit more self-explanatory. And you can see here kind of how the open primary ballot looks in North Dakota. Basically, it just tells you on the partisan ballot, you are permitted to vote for candidates of one political party only. So you would select, if you were voting on the Republican side, which of those people you want to earn your party's nomination for the presidency. Same over on the other side. Now, turnouts in primaries, not great. Better in some states than others, especially the states that get like an early primary where they're getting a lot of coverage, they're getting a lot of ads early on, that sort of thing. Caucuses have really poor turnouts, and as a result of that, both parties have kind of moved away from caucuses in recent years because if only 7 to 17% are showing up to participate in a caucus, it doesn't seem very representative, right? Now, there's some reasons for it. Caucuses take time. You can count on at least a couple hours at a caucus versus a few minutes at a voting booth. they're public. Some people don't like their politics public, right? Those sorts of things. In North Dakota, the Republicans use a primary for everything. The Democrats use a primary for everything under the presidency. They still use a caucus for the presidency. So that would be sort of one weird exception. But political parties in each state can choose what they want to do. And so that's the difference there, is the state parties have chosen to do things differently. Now, at the end of all this, each party ends up hosting a convention, usually in July or August of the election year. And this is going to be, at this point, basically like a 4-day infomercial where they try and sell their candidate to the American people. It used to be that we would actually, up until 1968, like not really know who was going to get the nomination, but now we can tabulate like every single delegate along the way. And so we know leading into the convention who is going to be the nominee. And this is really the opportunity to raise money, to sell them to the American people. It's all broadcasted on TV, right? And get some of those speeches in. You can see some examples. These were from the 2020 election cycle when they ended up not doing the full convention given the pandemic, but President Trump did his on the White House lawn, and then the Democratic primary was, or convention, I should say, was virtual. Now, how has it changed? The question here is whether the nominee for office should be chosen as democratically as possible, or should we leave the primary election process to party insiders? And up until about 1968, by and large, the major political parties were going just with party insiders and the leadership within the party. And so the idea was we all go into a room together, it's a bunch of party elites, smoking cigars, right? And they're talking about who should be the next person to run for president. And you had to be an elite. You didn't just get a pass in that room. It's 1968 and the chaos over the Vietnam War and the anti-war sentiment that blocks some support for the incumbent president, who's Lyndon Johnson at the time. Robert F. Kennedy emerged as sort of a favorite and then was assassinated, and party insiders end up choosing Hubert Humphrey. And many plain folk view the nomination of Humphrey as just a continuation of Johnson's policies, and they're not happy about that selection. And there's actually a lot of chaos that breaks out at the convention, a lot of violence and things like that. And ultimately, it's the last time that the Democrats do their nominations process in this traditional way, and they start to move more towards caucuses and primaries where the delegates are obligated to support the people that they were sent to support. Now, there's some pros and cons to this process being more democratic. In European countries with multi-party systems, we tend to see that it's still the party insiders kind of running the show. It's the party organization that decides who's allowed to run, what candidates end up filling seats, which candidates end up appearing on ballots, that sort of thing. And I think you can have a discussion there about voter education, especially early on in the primary process. But there's also that lack of representation. And if the will of the people isn't in line with the will of the party, then maybe the party should have to change because the people chose someone different, right? So there's definitely pros and cons to both. This is sort of the overview of how things changed after the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So up until that time, the nominations process was in the hands of party leaders. Candidates just enlisted the support of party members, party bosses, right? And there was little or no public participation in this process. And lots of times national party conventions would start without anyone knowing who was going to end up being nominated. Even sometimes the people that ended up being nominated went into the convention not knowing that it was going to land on them, right? There was a lot of sort of political maneuvering that would happen at these things. But since 1968, ultimately, we have candidate-dominated campaigns that work independently of the party establishment to run their primary election campaign. Most delegates are selected through the primary and caucus process, and so those nominations are determined largely by voter decisions. And as a result, the nominee is usually determined before the convention ever begins. Once the main campaign kicks off, then we're kind of in a whole new ballgame where we're trying to appeal to the masses, not just our supporters. And at one time, this might have looked like parades and rallies and train stops and shaking hands on factory floors or at shopping malls, right? And a lot of traveling and in-person appearances. And certainly today, people still use some of those tactics, though I don't think the Secret Service loves the idea of standing outside the top of a limo anymore. But today's candidates increasingly use television and other forms of broadcasting to reach the public. And so even if they are somewhere in person at a rally, it can reach more widespread through that television visual as they appear in broadcast and that sort of thing. We've also seen a lot of campaigns turn to social media and things like that to connect with voters. And so the consequence of sort of the new age way of campaigning is not that it's any more, manipulative or misleading than old style campaigning, but campaigns have become sort of in some ways divorced from the process of governing. They used to be led by party leaders who had to worry about getting their candidate reelected. But a lot of campaigns today are run by political consultants who ultimately don't take responsibility for governing, and they're more likely to hop from candidate to candidate when the candidate that they previously repped doesn't sort of fit the bill anymore, doesn't seem electable anymore, right? So there's a lot of people who work in consulting to run campaigns today versus just the political party running the campaign. What matters to voters when it comes to electing a president? Well, voters tend to assign credit or blame for the conditions of the country to the party of the standing president, the incumbent president. So they hold that incumbent party responsible for the overall wellness of the country. And there's certainly some validity to that, though the president is also not like all controlling over all factors of the economy or things like that. And so campaigns are going to focus on calling attention to this. Like if the economy is in a state of turmoil, you are going to hear the opposition party talk about that and try and get voters moved over to their side, or you're going to hear the incumbent party taking credit for all the good things that have happened under their watch, so on and so forth. We also know that about 90% of voters are going to support their party's nominee. So registered party members are very, very likely to support their nominee, and campaigns help people understand why they should do that, why they should support their candidate. And so they do that through appearances and ads and debates and all of those different things to give voters some reason to support. Voters generally prefer candidates that seem like they would be strong leaders. You've maybe heard that in the Kennedy-Nixon debate, Nixon was like sweating a lot, and voters were like, "Oh, he's weak, right? This is making him nervous," that sort of thing. So strong leadership, it tends to be a core thing that a lot of voters look for. Some of these other things have maybe changed over time, but you can see some different traits that voters tend to mention when they're talking about what would make a good president. And so campaigns try and invoke those traits, right? They try and prove that their candidate fits that mold, right? And sometimes proving these traits is actually easier than taking positions on issues where the rivals are going to have different views, right? If we can sell our candidate as a person of integrity and with empathy and an intelligent individual who will know what to do under pressure, that's sometimes an easier sell than saying, well, this is how they feel about abortion, or this is how they feel about marijuana, so on and so forth. And in modern campaigns, candidates are usually the ones that are responsible for conveying most of their message to voters. Voters can hear from them directly through social media, through televised speeches, so on and so forth. And so that's why we have a lot of money, billions of dollars in every election cycle spent on campaign communications and campaign events, right? Things like participating in debates and attending conventions and rallies, and especially in swing states, meeting with voters and making themselves present in that way. Now, if you are watching this in class or watching this for homework, this is the end of part 1 of chapter 10, and I'm going to move on to chapter 2 now, which is about campaign finance. So you can pause the video here for today, be done for today, and pick up on this another time. But we're going to talk today a little bit about campaign finance and how it influences campaigns today. And so this is an example of a 1040 form, and that is where you fill out your tax return. And when you fill out your tax return, whether digitally or through the paper form, you are going to be asked if you would like $3 to go to something called the Presidential Election Fund. And I want you to think just for a minute if you would consider checking that box or not, and then why or why not. Now, I'm guessing a lot of you said, no thanks, I don't want to check that, I don't know which candidate it's going to, so on and so forth, and that's very valid. But this matching fund was actually created as a major piece of campaign finance regulation, whose goal was to reduce a candidate's dependence on large contributions from individuals, special interest groups, and corporations. And so what this fund did is it created this sort of pool of money from tax dollars that would match the first $250 of a citizen's contribution. So if I gave money to a candidate up to $250, if they took matching funds, that candidate would actually receive $500. Seems like a pretty good deal for them. But this was the caveat, right? Is that if they were to take matching funds, they would have to agree to spending limits within their campaign. And a lot of candidates did this for a number of years, but it's actually, I believe, the Obama re-election campaign that decides we don't need matching funds. We can outraise and outspend the best of them. And pretty much since then, about every political campaign has taken that same approach. And so this pool of money today is largely used to fund the political conventions of the two major political parties. Now, this is sort of the timeline we're going to talk through today, okay? Generally, what happens is some sort of new campaign finance law is passed, and part of that law is going to be challenged in court. Part of about every law is challenged in court. And when the court overturns a portion of the law, usually it creates a loophole, a way of getting around some of the requirements of the law. So the first piece of legislation we're going to talk about is the Federal Election Campaign Act, and it's signed in two parts in 1972 and 1974. And sort of the background of that, this is passed in the wake of the Watergate affair, right? So Watergate happens, we find out there's corruption within the campaign to the highest level, and so Congress must attempt to like vet out that corruption. And so they decide to pass some campaign finance regulations. And it does a variety of different things, right? It creates that public financing system that we just talked about. It created the Federal Election Commission and its disclosure process. So when you give money, you have to have your name attached to it, right? You have to have your address attached to it. We need to know where the money's coming from. And then the final thing it tried to do really is set limits on the amount of money that campaigns could take in. And there were a variety of limits they addressed. They said, even if you don't take public financing, okay? Even if you use your own money, just we're capping the dollar amount. This is how much you can spend on campaigns, right? It also created a ban on independent expenditures. And independent expenditures is money that's spent outside of the campaign by independent groups. Say, example, like a labor union making some sort of ad that is, pro Trump or pro Harris. So on and so forth. You've definitely seen ads like this where at the end it's like paid for by Americans for Liberty, right? Versus like paid for by the Trump campaign, that sort of thing. So they tried to ban that. And a 1976 ruling called Buckley v. Valeo challenged the validity of the Federal Election Campaign Act and asked whether or not the limits placed on electoral expenditures on spending was actually a violation of the First Amendment's freedom of speech and expression clauses. And so they argued before the court that money is speech, and the court agreed. They said the court relied on the First Amendment and the freedom of speech to make their ruling, that by spending money on campaigns, I am making a political statement, right? When I give money to a candidate, that is public support for that candidate. Now, again, a handful of years later in 2002, also after a very contentious campaign, the 2000 election had gone to the Supreme Court to be settled. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act is the next major piece of congressional reform. And as it sounds, it was passed by a bipartisan group in Congress, but immediately as it goes into effect in 2002, it's challenged in court by interest groups and labor unions and so on and so forth. And so the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act tried to eliminate soft money. And soft money was defined as like money that's given to the parties for party building. So I'm going to donate money to the Republicans or donate money to the Democrats to build up the party. Well, they just go and they spend that money on campaigns. So I shouldn't be able to do that, right? Because then I'm just like skirting the disclosure process that the FEC wants to oversee, right? And so they said, no more soft money. You can't just give money to the parties and say it's not for campaigning. It's for campaigning, right? But they said, we'll give you this. Hard money limits increase. So the money that you give directly to the campaigns you can give more than you used to, right? So give more money directly to the candidates. We already had a ban on foreign money. That's strengthened in this law. They beef up the disclosure. If you ever give money to a campaign, they're not just going to ask you your name and address. They're going to ask you your employer, they might ask you some demographic pieces, so on and so forth. Again, they try and ban independent expenditures within 60 days of the general election or 30 days of the primary. So unions, corporations, nonprofits, you can make your ads, but you can't run them within 60 days of the election. Well, then what's the point, right? And then they also tried to prohibit minors from making political contributions. That's overturned in a case called McConnell versus FEC. That would be Mitch McConnell, former Senate Majority Minority Leader, filed suit to challenge this, and the Supreme Court found everything except for that prohibition on minors to be constitutional in that case in 2003. Now, at this point, we think of corporate money coming into campaigns as sort of like a slow trickle, like a little breach in our leak. We have just a leaky dam, like a little corporate money is getting through, that sort of thing. But Citizens United versus FEC, which is a Supreme Court case that's decided in 2010, kind of breaks the dam wide open and is considered the breach that allows just floodgates of money to come into our campaigns. Now, what Citizens United actually did is it overturned this prohibition on independent expenditures. So, again, they rely on the precedent set in Buckley v. Vallejo, which is that money is speech. And now they look at that through the view of like, well, do unions, do corporations, do nonprofits have free speech rights in the same way that individuals do, right? And ultimately, Citizens United was a group that sought an injunction, that is a court order, against the Federal Election Commission that had prevented the Citizens United group to film or to show its film, to air its film, which was called Hillary, the movie. And the movie essentially expressed opinions about whether Senator Hillary Clinton would make a good president when she was running against Barack Obama in the 2008 primary. And ultimately, they thought it was a film. The FEC says, no, this is just a feature-length ad. You can't run it, so on and so forth. And so they filed suit based on First Amendment grounds. And again, whether or not preventing corporations and labor unions from funding this type of communication was a violation of free speech, and the court found that to be true. So that allows a lot of money in, and it has allowed for billions of dollars to come into our elections, and certainly a lot of corporate money and things like that. The Supreme Court continues to look at similar cases, and so we'll see if the precedent changes at all in coming years. Talk a little bit more about that FEC disclosure piece, okay? So the FEC is the Federal Election Commission, and they oversee all money dealing with campaigns. You can actually find this information on their website. You can go, you can like type people in, you can see who they gave money to, so on and so forth. You can click on campaigns and you can see where the campaigns got their money, so on and so forth, right? Now, before I can tell you about what the FEC can and cannot see, I need to give you some boring definitions from the Federal Tax Code. So a 527 is an organization that under Section 527 of the tax code can raise and spend money to advance political causes. they often spend money on behalf or in opposition to candidates, and they're usually not regulated under state or federal campaign finance laws because they don't expressly advocate for the election or defeat of a candidate or party. They might generally mention those things, but they are going to, stray away from words like vote for, right? Or things like that. 527 is an example, is going to be a political action committee or a PAC. And so there's an example here. You can look up an ad on YouTube called Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. This was like a 2004. John Kerry was running against George W. Bush in his re-election campaign, and they assert that Kerry is like unfit to serve for president based on his distortion of his conduct during Vietnam, and they make him out to be unpatriotic, right? And all of those things. They don't say like don't vote for John Kerry, but they definitely try and convince you that John Kerry's not a good guy. Now, a 501c4, another section of the tax code, is a nonprofit organization that's exempt from federal income tax. However, donations to them are not tax deductible. And usually in campaign finance, 501c4s are used as shell corporations, sort of a way of hiding money. They are where dark money, so we've talked soft money, hard money, now dark money comes into the picture. Now, one of these final pieces of information that might be important to know before we talk about this FEC disclosure piece is that both major pieces of finance legislation tried to limit independent expenditures, and both times the Supreme Court found that limitation to be unconstitutional. So independent expenditures are allowed, and that is groups that are spending money independently of the campaigns in an effort to influence the election. And sometimes those groups are going to be 527s, they're going to be PACs, right? Now, the loophole that comes out of Citizens United is called a super PAC, and a super PAC is actually formally known as a independent expenditure only committee. So they may not give money to candidates or political parties, but they can engage in unlimited political spending independently of the campaigns. So unlike traditional PACs, they can raise funds from individuals, corporations, unions, so on and so forth, with no legal limit on donation size. So when it comes to what the FEC can see, we're going to talk a little bit about corporations and some of the challenges in modern campaign finance. So B&L here is going to be our sample corporation. They're just the corporation from Disney's WALL-E, right? Pretty harmless. And so corporations by law cannot give money directly to candidates, but they can spend it indirectly on campaigns. So they might traditionally use a PAC to donate. So they can give money to a PAC, which is a 527. Their contributions are going to be limited and their name is going to be disclosed. So because PACs are campaigns in nature, right? The FEC keeps an eye on them and they see where they get their money from. Now, this PAC can turn around, they can give money to the candidate, right? So, for example, you might collect, like the NRA, for example, has a PAC, and they're going to take all this money in and then they're going to divvy it up based on who supports, their perspective on the Second Amendment. And that could be a lot of different candidates, right? But if I go to this candidate, I see they get money from this PAC, and then I click on the PAC, I can see where the PAC got their money from. Everything is disclosed, okay? Now, what if I want to spend more than $5,000? I want to give 500 grand, right? well, then I can't give it to a traditional PAC because those contributions are limited, but I could give it to a super PAC, an independent expenditure only committee. And super PACs are also watched by the FEC because they're a 527 as well. And so the contributions are unlimited, but the name is still disclosed. Now, the super PAC can't give this money to a candidate. They just have to create their own independent expenditures in an attempt to influence or have an indirect influence over the election. Now, the final question is, well, what if this corporation doesn't want their name to be found? And why wouldn't they want their name to be found, right? And so ultimately, I think some corporations are more than happy to put their politics on display, but a lot of corporations also recognize that that could impact their customer base and it could hurt their bottom line. And so they might still want to have an influence on government, but they don't want to face the repercussions with their customers. And so this might be the way they do it. They give money to a 501c4, which is not overseen by the FEC because it's technically like a educational, entity. So they give money there. And then the 501c4 can give as much money as they want to a super PAC. Okay. Now again, the super PAC can't give money to the candidate, but ultimately a lot of candidates have their own super PACs. They're just run by other people. So now, if I go on the FEC website, I click on this super PAC. I see that they got money from this 501c4, but I can't see who gave money to the 501c4. And so there's no disclosure. That, folks, is what we call dark money. Okay. Now, you would think with all this money that money should be a decisive factor in winning. And when it comes to presidential elections, it's actually not, right? How much money a presidential candidate spends on a campaign really has no influence on their electability. Okay. What's most important to voters is the economic conditions of the country, the character of the candidate, so on and so forth. And then there's also, safe states and safe districts and all that stuff with the Electoral College and gerrymandering and so on and so forth, which we'll get to at a later time. Now, I want to give this one example of where money can maybe have an impact, but doesn't necessarily mean just because you outspend, you're going to win. June 2017, up until the next election cycle, like 2018, Georgia's House race for the 6th district was one of the most expensive House campaigns in U.S. history. And I actually don't think this one even comes in the top 10 anymore, but it was just an obscene amount of money for the time that was spent on this race. The campaigns ultimately, for this one House seat in Georgia, raised $28 million in disclosed donations, not to mention the undisclosed stuff. $23 million of which went to Jon Ossoff, who is now in the U.S. Senate for Georgia, but he way outspends Karen Handel in this safe Republican district. He's a Democrat, she's a Republican. And he's running in this really safe Republican district where Republicans win by like 20 points, right? And he way outspends her, still loses, but only by a 4-point margin. So they go from about a 20-point margin to a 4-point margin. Still doesn't win, right? Like I said, this race no longer makes the top 10 most expensive House races. The top 10 expensive House races today ranged in price tags between $31 and $42 million. Now, maybe next time I record this lecture, I won't be talking about this because this system hasn't worked as well in the last couple of presidential elections, but your textbook talks a little bit about some of the factors that influence election outcomes. And the keys to the White House was a system that was developed by Alan Lichtman, and he used this system to predict the popular vote results in American presidential elections, based on a theory of pragmatic voting, that people were, thinking through some of these things and making logical choices. Now, America's electorate, according to his theory, chooses a president not according to any events of the campaign, but according to how well the party in control of the White House has governed the country. If the voters are content with the party in power, it will gain 4 more years in the White House. If not, the challenging party will prevail. Thus, the choice of a president does not rely on debates, advertising, speeches, endorsements, rallies, platforms, promises, or campaign tactics, but primarily on the performance of the party while holding the White House. Now, you can see some of the keys here, right? It's like, is there a serious contest for the incumbent party nomination, right? Is the incumbent party the sitting candidate, the sitting president, so on and so forth, right? There's a bunch of different things about scandal and social unrest, and you can see a couple of things on the economy. And so he said, if 5 or fewer of my keys are false, then the incumbent party will win. And if 6 or more are false, then the challenging party will win. And ultimately, he has been correct in 9 out of the 11 past elections. He was wrong on Harris in the most recent election. So, like I said, we'll see if Alan Lichtman keeps himself in the history books here. But this was his theory, is that presidential elections are not about the campaign. They're about control of the White House and whether or not the party does it well. Now, as a result, maybe, congressional elections have become increasingly independent of presidential elections. And so, usually in a presidential race, they tend to be more competitive, meaning the winner is usually getting less than 55% of the vote. They get more voters, definitely higher turnout rates during presidential elections, and tend to be held more responsible by voters, as Lichtman addresses in his 13 Keys to the White House. But congressional races tend to be less competitive. Usually the winner gets over 60% of the vote. There's might be a couple of reasons for that, one of which is gerrymandering. We'll talk about that when we get into our lesson on Congress. Incumbency advantage in Congress is huge. People tend to re-elect the people that are currently sitting in office. There tends to be fewer voters, lower turnout in midterm elections, and they can deny some of the responsibility of what's going on, right? They're a body of 435, not a body of 1. And so even if the president is a Republican and they are a Republican, they can say, well, that's him, that's not me, right? And tend to be able to deny some of that responsibility. Now, the American system of government ultimately moderates the pace of change, which makes it very difficult for newcomers in office to adopt really radical policies. But sometimes we have elections where there is a dramatic shift as a result of the election. One party might take over power in the Senate and the House and have a majority on the court and take the presidency. And that can allow policy to change pretty dramatically as a result. But in more normal times, who wins elections, I mean, it does have important implications on public policy. It's just how rapid is that change, right? Now, campaign promises often become policy, especially early in the term, whether it's through congressional legislation or executive order. But sometimes those policies take time. In the case of congressional policies, They're going to require compromise with the opposition party. In the case of executive orders, they might face challenges by the court, so on and so forth. So all of that tends to make policy changes less radical. And that's a wrap on Chapter 10 notes, guys. Have a great rest of your day.